a movement which, as Jack McQuethy has pointed out, not only is remarkably silent and lacking in communication, but every time we turn on the news and see another development, it points to a higher level of sophistication and a higher level of preparation.
All right, Tony, let me play devil's advocate here just for a second, or maybe I should say ignorant advocate. I accept the notion that this could be a very, very sophisticated operation, required communications on a level that our intelligence or the U.S. intelligence services don't appreciate. But is it not similarly possible that three members, just three men of one organization, could agree on, what is the date today? The 11th. On the 11th of the month at such and such an hour would try to hijack three airplanes and try to crash them into a building. Might it not be as simple as that?
No, Peter, it simply can't be. Because first, flying an aircraft into a building, a pilot is not going to commit suicide in ways that kill thousands of extra people. It is not something that you're going to do by pointing a gun at a pilot's head.
Okay.
You're not going to take an aircraft out of pattern and suddenly divert three aircraft without creating virtually any warning because the attacks are so close together. You're not going to be able to bypass the security measures in three different airport locations. You're not going to be able to take over an aircraft with one man, particularly if you want it to fly a suicide mission. And you are not going to be able to add to this potential additional cases where aircraft have crashed that may also have been at terrorist hands.
Very interesting. Now, Tony, let me just take this a step further. Your business of the pilot issue is really to the point, which was, who knows, a commercial airline pilot who's going to deliberately fly his aircraft into a building, even at the cost of his own life in the cockpit. So you do presume that somebody else is in the seat flying this aircraft.
That's right, Peter, and I think we need to understand that the very sophistication of these aircraft make them much easier to fly, that it is much easier to program them to change their course. It doesn't take a pilot with vast experience to fly one mission ending in killing large numbers of people. But they do have to be trained, they do have to know something about the simulator at least, inside the aircraft, and even if they have the pilot under their control, they have to know a lot about the way planes fly to force a pilot to be so precise in their targeting.
You make very good points, and you therefore assume that there is a lot of money involved in an operation like this.
I think that's a dangerous assumption, Peter.
Okay.
We always use these phrases, $100 million or $10 million. What it requires is a lot of political commitment, ideological commitment. It isn't something three people can do. It is potentially something that perhaps 30 or 40 can do. It is possible that only one major cell of some terrorist organization is involved. But I think we also have to ask another question now, and that is whether some state that hosted this movement knew about it and assisted, because there are elements of sophistication which raise that prospect.
Stay with us for a second, Tony, because Vince Canestraro, who also talks on the subject of terrorism and does more than talk on the subject of terrorism for us, is also here at the moment. Vince, do you want to make some comments about this?
Yeah, Peter, I think that Tony makes some good points about the complexity and the sophistication of the operation. But I think also we have to see what kind of organizations in the past have been willing to do such a coordinated attack. And,
why is that a clue?
Because it's a pattern. We see people who committed suicide in these operations. So that points us away from a secular organization to a religiously oriented group. We've seen a pattern of planning against 5 U.S. airliners in 1993 with Ramzi Youssef when his safe site was inspected in Manila in '93. The FBI found evidence that he had been planning to hijack and blow up in flight 5 United airliners flying out of the Far East. Now, that was a very ambitious operation, and I don't think anyone believed that he could actually have done it. But here we are some 8 years later, and we see a coordinated operation and 3 planes hijacked and blown up against targets, obviously suicide operations, bringing a lot of other people with them. That tends to point us towards a religiously organized group, perhaps towards Al-Qaeda, but again, with some state support. We've seen these groups evolve in their professionalism over the last several years. We go from...
Vince, can I just interrupt you for one second? Just to try to keep you on the straight and narrow here. It may be a reach to blame. It may be a reach to blame a religious organization. I agree that we've come to accept the notion that some members, some people who worship Islam, in the Middle East have found a better life giving themselves up as suicide. But aren't you sort of already directing and creating something of a mindset about an investigation that's more complicated than that?
Oh, certainly. And there's no question that this group, whatever it was, had some professional support, perhaps from a military and a state. The explosives, the way you would fly an aircraft. But it does point towards a group that has members who are willing to kill themselves in carrying out a punishing act against the United States. And there are only a few groups like that we know of. Secular radical Palestinian groups traditionally don't do this kind of thing.
Right.
We haven't seen that. The ones that we've seen that carried out suicide bombings tend to be Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, and of course Hezbollah. And so you've got basically a handful of potential suspects. None of this proves anything, of course, but it does tend to focus an investigation.
Let me ask you both, you, Vince, and then Tony Cordesman second. Just on the basis of history and on the basis of your own individual expertise, what do you think the chances are of the United States finding out who did this? First of all, you, Vince.
I think that there's a fairly good chance of finding out who did this because the people who did this are going to brag, they're going to talk, they're going to try and claim credit in a way that doesn't bring attention directly to them. But they will talk to other people, and some of our intelligence resources will pick this up, and that will lead us in a certain direction. And then they will go back to the database of threat warnings that they've had in the recent past. The U.S. has had a worldwide terrorism alert for some time that was just renewed yesterday, but again, the focus of those threats was abroad, U.S. installations abroad. They'll go back and see whether or not some of their intelligence operations that were picking up these threats may have been the recipient of deception. In other words, the group that may have done this may have been broadcasting deceptive information that we thought was legitimate threat information against a foreign installation while they were really planning to do this kind of an operation.
Thanks very much, Vince Canestrano. I'll go to Tony Cordesman right away, but I just want to remind people, if you watched the news yesterday, you noticed that you recall that we reported that a man named Ahmad Massoud, who was the last independent militia leader, not member of the Taliban in Afghanistan, was, we believe, killed. There's still some debate about whether he's dead or not, but certainly was attacked by his enemies, one of them disguised as a television cameraman. And the United States was very open to admit that what the United States lost when Massoud was killed yesterday was access into Afghanistan for U.S. intelligence operatives. And so I turn now to Tony Cordesman for a quick comment on how quickly, how easily, how complicated, how difficult, how impossible might it be to find out who did this?
Peter, let's consider several realities. We never found and punished the people who blew up the Marine Corps barracks.
In Beirut.
That's right. We have never really addressed who led the attack on Al-Khobar, and the people who've been punished were at the lowest possible level.
Those are the civilian and military barracks in Saudi Arabia.
That's right. And when we go back to Libya and what happened to Pan Am 103, one person has been imprisoned. We have never gone beyond attacking low-level people in an incident of this magnitude to attack the leaders and the core of the group with success. But we have never before really encountered things so serious that we are on the edge of war.
And in the case of Pan Am 103, the United States alternated between blaming Syria for supporting the operation and or Libya, which supported the operation. So you're really reaffirming how complicated this is.
More than that, Peter, I think the key element is that if any state is involved in this in any way, if it knew this was going to happen or it shoulders a movement once we identify it, we find ourselves with issues about war and peace which we have never before encountered in terrorism.
Well, you certainly put your finger on one more point. I'd like you to hold that, Tony, for a second, because nothing could be more, in some respects, potentially dangerous at the moment. But let's not lose focus for today. We'll come back to Tony Cortesman and talk about American reaction to the rest of this world. But in the meantime, we have a disaster here in New York City, which is a national disaster, and we have a disaster in Washington because there's been an attack on the nation's military establishment. And we have at least one major plane crash in Pennsylvania today, which we believe is related, but in its own way is a national disaster, as the crash of a major airliner often is. And I want to go to, before we get carried away by theory on terrorism, no offense to my colleagues, let's go back to Lower Manhattan, where Bob Jameson is with George Stephanopoulos. And Bob has been visiting hospitals in the last little while, and so I think the two of you together can bring us up to date on the scene.
George, if I might, I'll start first because I've just returned from St. Vincent's Hospital, which, Peter, is a little more than a mile from the World Trade Center and is a principal destination today for those who were injured in this disaster. And as one measure of how large it is, by midday there were about 200 people, 18 of them critically injured, who were brought to St. Vincent's, which is about 20 more than were injured, than were brought to St. Vincent's after the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. The injuries that the doctors are reporting are not principally respiratory injuries, which was the case in 1993, but these are largely crushing injuries. And Peter, 5 hours after the first plane went into the World Trade Center, ambulances are still arriving regularly at St. Vincent's. They are conducting triage, classifying the degree of injury outside on the sidewalk in front of St. Vincent's, and they don't have a clear idea of how many more injured may go there, as well as the other hospitals in New York, and now we hear some in New Jersey.
And Peter, that's in part because we've just got a report from John McKenzie out in the field who talked to William Hull, the head of the Port Authority, who said that formal search and rescue operations haven't even begun yet. The bulk of the effort right now by the police and the fire department and others is simply to establish the integrity, the safety of the World Trade Center building. Second, what's left on the site of the World Trade Center. Secondly, Peter, they reported that there's a staggering number of firefighters still on the site, up to 200 that they can't account for yet. They were able to talk to one firefighter on the scene, though, who said that their biggest problem now is not having fire hydrants to put out these small pockets of fires that are cropping up all across the site. And secondly, Peter, there's a problem now with broken gas lines, which they fear could ignite further explosions.
George, could
Peter,
I just...
if I might add.
Yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I just add one thing. I was struck by something at St. Vincent's. The Red Cross, as you may know, has put out a plea for blood donors, particularly those with the less common types of blood, such as O. But even before that plea went out, thousands of people spontaneously showed up at St. Vincent's. Thousands of people, and many of them told us, this is what we think we can do to help. We can't do anything else, sitting at home watching on television.
This is a breaking news update from Oklahoma.
You would have heard us, but we...
Hi, I'm Cindy Morrison. We're going to cut into national programming for just a moment to update you on the local situation. All right, first, Tulsa is not in a state of emergency. There's a rumor that gas will be in short supply and that there will be a price hike. Well, let me tell you, these rumors have sparked fights and long lines at local gas stations. Police are asking folks to calm down. We are not in a state of alert right here in Tulsa. In other news this afternoon, the Tulsa airport is closed. Flights around the country have been grounded. Let's join Diane Harrigan for the latest there. And Diane, we just got word about 13 flights diverted to our airport that were up in the air at the time.
That's right. Throughout the day, about 13 flights have been diverted here. And, there are no planes, of course, taking off. The biggest problem for passengers right now, though, is trying to get to their destination. And as you can see behind me, there's a lot of people that are just sitting around. They're waiting for rental cars or buses to take them to hotels. A lot of buses are also going to some of the shorter destinations like Dallas. I know Hertz had some vans going to Dallas earlier. But a lot of people just are not going to be able to get out today at all. We are told that there are virtually no more rental cars left here here, there was such a mad dash at the rental counters that they literally ran out. But the airport is open. There are just no planes taking off right now. And as you said earlier, about 13 flights were diverted here. Things are very calm, but it is still at a heightened state of alert. A level 4 is what we're told. Reporting live from Tulsa International Airport, Diane Harrigan, News Channel 8.
Diane, thanks. She mentioned a level 4 there at the airport. We want to mention other closings today. State and federal buildings, Promenade Mall, TCC, and downtown streets in Oklahoma City. Schools, though, are open, although some after-school activities have been canceled. Please check with your local school district, but again, classes continue today. And many churches around town are open this afternoon, and they're planning services for tonight. Our National Guard is on heightened alert. Defense Delta, that is the highest alert. Reserve deputies have been called in. Police deputies have not been called, or police reserve have not been called in at this point. But right now, police are dealing with situations at many local gas stations. That seems to be the story right here in Tulsa, and it is a story, of course, we are covering. But please remain calm. One last thing, the Red Cross is taking blood, and centers will be open extended hours. You can call the Red Cross for many, many locations all across the area that are opening as the hours pass. And if you have been unsuccessful in contacting a family member in New York or Washington, D.C., call the American Red Cross. The local number here in Tulsa to call is 831-1149. You can call and file a family well-being inquiry. And we will continue to update you on all the local effects of this national tragedy throughout the day. But please keep in mind, there is no state of emergency here in Tulsa. Now back to ABC coverage.
Calling us from Bellevue Hospital, which is over on the east side of Manhattan, quite some distance from this. Sylvia, do you hear me? Cynthia, do you hear me?
I do, Peter.
Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, we've been able to get into the Disaster Command Center, which is located here at Bellevue. As you say, it's about 20 or 30 blocks north and east of the actual site of the Twin Towers. But this is where the city puts its resources to prepare for an emergency. They rehearse here, practice here for disasters, and today we were allowed in the first group of journalists to go inside and see where they were running the disaster relief from. Let me paint a picture for you, if I might, of the room. It's about a 30 by 15 room, about 10 people crowded around a conference table, about 15 phone lines coming into the room. The mayor's office, emergency services, police and fire, all of those efforts being coordinated through this room. It was surprisingly calm, surprisingly quiet. It is located in the heart of the emergency room here at Bellevue Hospital, Peter, and the emergency room itself is busy. They've had about 140 to 150 people come through Bellevue so far. We've also had the opportunity to talk to the director of the hospital here and to the man who heads up the emergency room. I can tell you a little bit about the injuries if you'd like.
Please do.
Because this is a hospital further away, they're getting the less seriously injured, although, having said that, of the 140 or 50 people, 40 of them are classified in serious condition. 2 were dead on arrival. They have 1 baby who is being treated. 3 to 5 operating rooms are currently going with what the doctor characterized as extremely serious surgeries. The doctor running the operation here said that they have sent a team of physicians closer to the site, and they're going to be setting up tent hospitals closer to the site to help some of the enormous flow of injuries. Nobody made it here to this hospital until about 2 hours after the blast. And they believe, I've been listening to the coverage, they believe that it's not going to be for many more hours until they feel the full brunt of this over here.
Okay. Thank you, Cynthia, very much. Come back to us, please. When you get even better handle of this. We've talked a little bit about the blood shortage, which, as I said, is a national issue. But in New York City, there are supplies of blood so far. People did respond very quickly and lined up ready to give blood at some of the blood centers here. There is a supply of O-type blood. O negative appears, as best we can understand from the people who are collecting it, is the most important kind of blood needed at the moment because it's the universal donor, meaning anyone can actually get it. Now, there's a slight bit more of information like all information today, reasonably suspect at the outset, but the Associated Press is reporting that this airliner, this United Airlines jet, which crashed in Pennsylvania, which is a American Airlines, my apologies, United Airlines Flight 93. I don't quite know exactly what aircraft it was, a 767, I think, which we assessed uncertain about, did not know why it had crashed, whether it was part of this overall operation this morning. The AP is now quoting a man who minutes earlier, saying he was a passenger on the plane, told an emergency dispatcher in a cell phone call that we are being hijacked. We are being hijacked. Treat that, as you do all the information we give you today, as being preliminary at best, sometimes wrong. I think we've been pretty good about it today, and certainly confused, because listening to the mayor, listening to the governor of the state, both of whom we talked to, listening to the senator in charge of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, listening to all of our analysts, listening to everybody, the country is still very much in the middle of, if not immediate post-event chaos, certainly in terms of trauma, and trying to get a handle on what the hell's been going on here. And as we've said before, when you look at the television pictures of the Trade Center collapsed upon itself, these are buildings 110 stories high, and where thousands and thousands and thousands of people work. And I know on occasion we can run the images of it to the point of offensiveness. I hope we're not there, but this is what it looked like when one of the trade towers just appeared to either peel away or collapse on itself, but from top to bottom, 110 stories to the bottom. First one, the southern tower, Tower 1 or Tower 2, it doesn't matter what, just one tower and then the other, and then the other tower sometime later, which John Miller said the cops picked up very quickly, was looking weak and bending or leaning in one particular direction, indicating that when those two aircraft, one hitting one tower, the other hitting another, had gone straight into those towers with such force that even at the midpoint of the building, or in that case 2/3 up, something had happened to so totally weaken the infrastructure that this was like peeling a banana, except that it was full of people, or had many, many people in it. I think we have Senator John McCain on the phone from Washington. Am I right, Senator?
Yes, Peter, how are you?
I'm well, sir, thank you. I'm not well. None of us are well. You know that.
Yes.
What's on your mind?
Well, I think that this act obviously is one which would constitute an act of war. I believe that the American people should remain calm and rally behind our president, and I'm confident that our military and our president will find out the perpetrators of this outrage, and we will not only punish those responsible, but ensure that something like this never happens again. And clearly we need to look at our intelligence capabilities.
I don't mean for one second, Senator, to belittle the necessary thing you must say today, which is we'll find those who are responsible and we'll punish them, because Tony Cordesman has just pointed out very effectively how often we don't find the people and we don't get to punish them. But you say an act of war.
Yes.
Do you believe that if another country is somehow the patron of an individual or a group of individuals who has done this, we should go to war with that country?
Absolutely, because they have committed atrocity on a scale that's unprecedented in history that I know of. Everybody's talking about a second Pearl Harbor. At least that was an attack on military targets, not on the civilian community. This is an unspeakable outrage, and clearly we can and must find out who perpetrated it. And Tony Cordesman and I have great respect for him, but I believe that we have the capability to find it out, and we need to improve our intelligence capabilities, particularly in the area of human intelligence. We have wonderful satellite capabilities and technical capabilities. In the late 70s and early 80s, we, for all intents and purposes, dismantled our human intelligence capability, which divines motives, and that's something technical intelligence cannot do.
Well, I think those of us who cover intelligence in any way, Senator, know that human intelligence, or HUMINT as they call it in the trade, has been very difficult, particularly in places like Afghanistan. So just assume for a second Well, no, don't assume anything. But are you desperately frustrated at the moment in some respects because this was sort of, in many ways, this was bound to happen in some measure, and we may not be able to get at the perpetrators?
No, I think that among many other things, obviously sorrow is the overriding emotion, but also I don't think our lives will ever be the same again in some respect, especially those who use airliners with some frequency. There's always been questions and studies and tests of our airport security systems, and they've always found breaches in them. Obviously, that's going to have to be addressed, and that's going to be very inconvenient for Americans. But at the same time, we also have to reevaluate the importance of making sure that anyone who wants to try it is incapable of doing so. But the best way to address it, obviously, is going to the source.
Your Democratic colleague, Senator Biden, said a while ago, the terrorist wins again when it alters American lifestyle. I assume you believe the same thing?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the things that have been inflicted on the American people it staggers the imagination. And yet I believe that the best thing that we can do as Americans is remain calm, rally behind the President of the United States, and know with confidence that we will take whatever steps are necessary to prevent this from happening again. I don't think that there's any reason for Americans to feel a sense of panic.
Okay. Thank you, Senator McCain, very much indeed. Appreciate your time. Senator John McCain of Arizona, who knows a lot about violence, and many people in the country will think knows a lot about leadership as well. Former presidential candidate, often talking about doing it, or often considered to be doing it again. Claire Shipman is in Washington. Claire, where's Mr. Bush?
Well, Peter, we have a little bit of news on that front. As you know, he is in the air again on his way somewhere from Shreveport, Louisiana. We have been told by sources that he will not be coming to Washington. He is going to make another stop at an undisclosed secure location so that he can talk to people from there on the ground. His security team can assess just how safe it is back here in Washington. As you mentioned earlier, that there must be great political pressure for him to get back to Washington. These sources confirm just that. The political team wants him back home. He wants to come back home. His security team does not feel it is safe right now. They do think, though, and they're guessing right now, that he might be able to get back at some point this evening. But again, he's got at least one more stop. Another interesting point along those lines.
Hold on. One more stop?
One more stop between Shreveport and Washington. He's on his way now, we're told, to another undisclosed location that his security team considers secure. They won't tell us where it is, obviously.
But do we know? So, in other words, this one more stop is another security stop dictated by the Secret Service?
Indeed it is. And we would be guessing if we talked about another Air Force base or something of the kind, but they have a number of stops. And I'm told this one is not anywhere in the direction of Washington, but they have a number of places they can take him.
Let me ask you this. Have you heard any mention whatsoever of the possibility the President will come to New York?
No, there was a rumor to that effect earlier, Peter, but that was shot down, and my sources tell me he is not going anywhere near New York right now. That situation would create chaos that New York just doesn't need at this point.
Absolutely.
They've also told us that their full security plan is in effect. They do have the House and Senate leadership out of town. Condoleezza Rice is the only senior official remaining at the White House, and she will remain at the White House to try to coordinate efforts from there. Mrs. Bush has also been spirited away. She was on Capitol Hill this morning set to address Congress. She's been taken to an undisclosed location. Peter.
Now, there was some mention that there was some mention of the fact that the United Airlines aircraft that crashed east to southeast of Pittsburgh may have been, in fact, going in the direction of Camp David. Had you heard that?
I heard that, as you did. My security sources don't know anything about that,
okay.
So we haven't been able to confirm anything along those lines.
Then we'll leave it alone. Claire, thanks very much. We'll come back to you. Some of you know where the President is going to go next. Seems a little bit strange. Pierre Thomas, working the phones on the FBI. What have you got, Pierre?
Well, one of the first things that they are focused on, obviously, is the injured, but the next priority is to get to Dulles International Airport, which they are, and Boston Logan. They are going to talk to the Boston United and American airline officials. They're trying to get a sense of who was on the plane. Early on, they're very limited in what they can do. They're trying to assess the situation, but one of the first things they can try to do is try to get a sense of who was on the plane, try to begin to check out aliases, and that might lead them in some investigative direction. But they're very limited in the early stages in terms of what they can do.
Exactly. Many thanks. And as you and John Miller have reminded us several times today, we're covering a tragedy and we are covering a crime. And so the FBI is now beginning to get things together in terms of trying to piece together the elements of crime. The only thing you get out of the airplane, one assumes at this point, is a long time for now, evidence of explosives on board that were not the gas tanks, the black boxes, which survive pretty much anything. I think it is our experience. But in terms of trying to chase down the human beings, going to those two airports to see who got on board and checking the passenger list.
Absolutely. Things that they can't get at right now. They can't do very much investigative work at the scenes. Right. So where they go is where the plane took off from. Talk to those officials. One official told me, quote, "We're trying to talk to any and everyone who touched that plane, from maintenance workers to the people who ticketed the persons getting on the plane."
Great. Thanks, Pierre. Keep at it. By the way, the Federal Aviation Administration says that the earliest that they will allow flights to resume, this may change, will be noon tomorrow. More than 24 hours after they first ordered all aircraft not to take off and then all aircraft to land as soon as possible. And I think that all domestic U.S. flights are now currently on the ground. Some international flights coming from overseas are still on their way to West Coast airports and still in the air. But what is quite staggering here in a way is the FAA says they will only allow flights to resume at noon tomorrow. We're talking, if you add it up, about approximately somewhere in the neighborhood of 36,000 flights back and forth and up and down and all the interim places across the United States. We all know, those of us who travel by air on a regular basis, exactly how difficult air travel is and how much of it there is at the moment. But there's a outstanding example of what it means to put out an order like that. 36,000 flights going to be halted. In fact, I think Charlie Gibson, my colleague who was here when this happened this morning, has been looking particularly at this dimension of it. Charlie?
Well, Peter, I just found a note that all U.S. commercial aircraft, I wasn't absolutely certain what you said a moment ago, but that all U.S. commercial aircraft that were not involved in hijackings today, obviously, but we know what's happened to those planes that were hijacked, but all U.S. commercial aircraft have landed, and as you mentioned, there will be no flights resumed until noon tomorrow. A couple of just incidental events. Prince Andrew of England was headed for Atlanta when all of this happened. His plane turned around. King Abdullah of Jordan was also headed for the United States. And we now read that flights, Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, has canceled all flights over London because of concern of air security over that city. There are a number of other things going on. Some of these pale in significance to what's happening in New York and Washington, but we want to bring them to you anyway. And I'm going to give you some details of what are happening in various states around the country. Much of this redundant to some things Peter had said, some of it new information. This Sunday's Emmys Awards ceremonies in Los Angeles has been postponed because of today's terrorist attacks on the East Coast. The head of the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences says he's not going to set a new date for the ceremony until the national mourning that is going to take place is over. There were Latin Grammy Awards scheduled for tonight in Los Angeles. Those have been canceled. In the sports world, as we mentioned a while ago, and there's some other cancellations as well, the 15 baseball games have now been canceled around the country that were to be played in the major leagues tonight. The minor leagues postponed all of their playoff games. Their regular seasons are over, but the playoff games in the minor leagues have been canceled. The commissioner of baseball said in the interest of security and out of sense of deep mourning for the national tragedy that has occurred today, all Major League Baseball games for today have been canceled. The PGA Tour has canceled the beginning of tournaments on Thursday, and whether they will be further delayed is uncertain. Major League Soccer postponed all of the games it had scheduled for tomorrow night, and the National Football League says it is mulling over whether to postpone this weekend's schedule. Obviously, the effects of this are going to reverberate for many days, many weeks, many months.
Yeah.
And So there are those kinds of cancellations being discussed.
Okay, thanks, Charlie.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I just, as we want to go to try to bring it back together for people who, a lot of people have been not with us all day. The thousands of millions of people may have been glued to their televisions, impossible not to. But ABC's John Donvan has been following the events of the last few hours, and he has managed to put together, I suppose we could call it a chronology or a timeline, if you will. But here is some sense of what happened from the beginning.
We want to tell you what we know as we know it. We just got a report in that there's been some sort of explosion at
the first thing
World
any
Trade
television
Center
camera saw this morning was this. Just before 9 o'clock, roughly 15 minutes earlier, an American Airlines jet hijacked from Boston had crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. There were 92 people on board.
It does not appear that there's any kind of an effort up there yet. Now remember, oh my God.
My God.
That looks like a second plane.
I did not see a plane go in.
Minutes later, the second plane, the second tower. The fireball ate up the aircraft. It was a United Airlines flight, a 767 from Boston to Los Angeles. There had been 65 people on board.
Some sort of a concerted.
I was happening to look on the first tower, and I actually saw people waving where the first plane crashed through, and then it was unbelievable seeing this second jet come crashing into the second tower. What is going on?
New York City was staggered.
As soon as she got hit, I was thrown to a window. So I was very lucky.
We're going to interrupt this. We'll come back to this, I promise you, to go to a news conference being held by the Mayor of New York, Rudolph Giuliani.
And then, Governor, thank you very much for your assistance and your help and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for your leadership through this crisis. This is a vicious attack upon New York. It's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed. The first step has to be to make sure we do everything in our power to protect the people and to save the lives of those whose lives are still at risk and to help those who have been injured. And I want to commend the mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the federal government have all offered and made ready support to help us deal with this ongoing crisis. The people of New York are not only the freest and most diverse people in the world, we're also, I believe, the most capable of rising to meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now, we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done, to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of the people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the president, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, well, this is a horrible attack and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude. We will get through this, and we will continue to have a great and free country, state, and society.
Do we know the number of casualties at this point, sir?
I don't think we really want to speculate about that. The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear ultimately. And I don't think we want to speculate on the number of casualties. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible. And I don't think we will know the answer to that until sometime tomorrow or the next day.
Were there large numbers of firefighters?
There are a large number of firefighters and police officers who are in harm's way, and we don't know how many we've lost. But there's no doubt we've lost some firefighters and police officers.
Do you know anything about the cause of the explosions that brought the two buildings down yet? Was it caused by the planes or by something else?
We believe that it was caused by the after effects of the planes hitting the buildings. We don't know of an additional explosion after that.
Mr. Mayor, could you tell us, do you expect any further attacks on New York? Is there anything to indicate that there could be more bombs, more planes out there? I know originally there was a report that 8 planes had been hijacked, 4 have only been accounted for. What about the remaining 4? And is there any possibility that there could be bombs on the ground planted by some...
We have no specific information to that effect. Obviously, the city is now closed. The airspace around the city is closed, and we are on heightened alert. But we have no specific information suggesting any further attack.
Mr. Mayor, can you tell us where the planes came from? Two major warships coming into the port of New York.
I think to give the people of New York confidence, to show that the federal government is standing with us, and to just to make certain that nothing further happens. This has been a very, very difficult and traumatic day for the people of the United States and the people of the city. And I think that it's an act that shows that the federal government is going to do everything they can to support us and help us.
Can you give us an idea of the extent of the rescue effort that's going on right now in Lower Manhattan? What the scope of this operation?
There are over 1,000 rescue workers, probably about 2,000 that are deployed, trying to get into the buildings, trying to find people, trying to search for people. The governor and I spoke a couple of hours ago, and the governor has deployed the National Guard to relieve them because our people are going to need reinforcements pretty soon. But right now they don't want to leave because they're searching for innocent citizens, and they're searching for some of their brothers and sisters.
Are you finding survivors?
Yes, we have some numbers that we can give you. We have 1,500 people at Liberty State Park who were evacuated, described as walking wounded. They were evacuated by ferry and other means. There are about 600 as of about 15 minutes ago in local hospitals that we account for, 600 people that are being treated in local hospitals. And there are 150 in particular that were critical, that were moved by EMS. New York City has 170 hospitals. So we have a lot of hospitals, and we're utilizing all of them. Probably the one that was the hardest hit was St. Vincent's Hospital. And I would like to just single them out and commend them, because as I was rushing down there, after the first plane hit, and before the second, they were already deploying people on the street. I could see the doctors and nurses outside getting ready to receive people. And that was before the second plane actually hit the World Trade Center.
What was your experience down there?
Also, blood donations. We have several sites for blood donations. 153 East 53rd Street, 66th in Amsterdam, which is the Red Cross, and 310 East 67th Street. If people want to do something and they can donate blood, that's going to help not just today, but tomorrow and the next day. This relief effort is going to take some time.
Mr. Mayor, you were one of the first people down there. Can you describe the scene in your own words, what you saw down there?
I don't know that I'm really able to describe it. It was the most horrific scene I've ever seen in my whole life. We saw the World Trade Center in flames, a big gaping hole all the way on the top of it. We could see people jumping from the top of the building. And then we went into Barclay Street, 75 Barclay Street, I think it was, and we were there when the building collapsed. And it collapsed in part on 75 Barclay Street. So we were trapped in the building for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, trying to get out different exits. And we finally went through a basement and came out 100 Park Place.
Did you ever fear for your own safety, sir?
Sure, yeah.
What went through your mind?
I don't think anything went through my mind other than making sure that we all remained calm and found an exit and just tried to figure out the most intelligent thing to do. Probably the same thing that went through the minds of 10,000 other New Yorkers who I could see on the streets, and I really have to commend them. If you really want to know what New Yorkers are all about, you just watch the way in which they handled themselves. They didn't panic. They moved deliberately. They moved swiftly. But they didn't hurt each other. They helped each other. I mean, these are just the most wonderful people in the world.
Do we know anything about the composition of that dust that blankets Lower Manhattan? Is there any asbestos or any hazardous material in that dust?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to
Mr.
that.
Mayor,
There was a gas explosion related to this as well. Are you aware of that? There was a gas leak or possible explosion?
We don't believe it. We don't believe that's the case. No.
Mr. Mayor, can you tell us anything about where the planes come from, where the aircraft came from?
Bill Diamond reminds me that we've turned off the gas in the city buildings, just to be certain.
Can you tell us
as a
anything
precaution
about where these aircraft came from? There was a report they may have been hijacked in Boston.
I think we should leave. I think we should leave that up to the federal government to. Yes, we do have some information, but I think we should leave that up to the federal government to release that information. Our focus is on the relief efforts. And
Governor, do you
What about security for the rest of the
on the part of the United States for what happened here in this country, both in New York, Washington, and other places?
First step right now, Marcia, is to make sure we do everything to help those people who need our support, and whether they're injured or still trapped in buildings. The second thing is to make sure at the same time we're providing the maximum security against possible additional incidents. But clearly, this is an attack upon America. It's an attack upon our freedom and our way of life, and we must retaliate and go after those who perpetuated this heinous crime against the people of America.
Mayor, this is just compared to Pearl Harbor. Do you consider this to be an act of war? This has been compared.
I'll do both.
This has been compared to Pearl Harbor. Do you consider this to be an act of war?
This is a vicious, unprovoked, horrible attack on innocent men, women, and children. It's one of the most heinous acts, certainly in world history. And as the governor said, and I said to the president, we fully and completely support him in any action that he has to take in order to make an example out of the people who are responsible for this.
Is it an act of war in your mind?
I don't know that I want to use those words. I think the president is the one that has to respond, and I think what he has to know is that all of us in New York support him, and support him completely in the efforts that he's going to have to make over the next couple of days, week, and to make a point that people can't do this. You can't attack innocent men, women, and children. And ultimately, I'm totally confident that American democracy and the American rule of law will prevail. And the people of New York are going to help to demonstrate that over the next couple of days.
Anybody take responsibility for this? Any group take responsibility at this time? And what is the city doing to safeguard the citizens now that something like this has happened?
Well, first of all, I don't know of anyone that's taken responsibility for it at this time. And secondly, the New York City Police Department is fully deployed, not just in the rescue effort, but all throughout the city of New York, offering as much protection and as much security as we're capable of for the citizens of the city. And at this point, I believe that the people in New York City can demonstrate our resolve and our support for all of the people that were viciously attacked today by going about their lives and showing everyone that vicious, cowardly terrorists can't stop us from being a free country and a place that functions. And we'll do everything we can to make that point.
Jennifer Steinauer, please. Just a housekeeping. Can you please tell us what's going to happen to the New York primary?
This morning, I issued an order suspending the primary across the state. There will be no primary today, and we'll reschedule it once we get through this.
Jennifer,
Mayor, can you
please.
please walk us through the municipal services right now? What's going on with the subways and the schools, the courts?
The subway, the schools, the chancellor, I commend the chancellor. He was on the phone a number of times with us. He coordinated very, very carefully what would happen. He thought it out, and he came up with a very good plan, which was essentially to keep the schools open, to keep the children in school, so we didn't have a large number of children in the different boroughs that would be released from school. They're being released, I shouldn't say as normal, but basically on the normal schedule. If parents aren't there to pick up the young children, then the children will be taken to a center, and the parents will be notified to come and pick them up. The children who have Metro cards, who normally travel on the subway, will be able to do that. The subways are functioning in 4 of the 5 boroughs, and can we get an update, Joe, on how the subway's doing in Manhattan?
All the lettered lines are working.
And in Manhattan?
In Manhattan lines, all the lettered lines.
All the lettered lines are working, including in Manhattan. And throughout the rest of the city, public transportation is normal. So the children should be able to return from school in the normal fashion. And if any children don't have parents to pick them up, then we'll hold them, let the parents know, and then the parents can come and pick them up.
Mr. Mayor, you mentioned you were on Barclay Street. What's the radius of damage that's been affected? How many other side streets around the world?
I don't think we know yet. The whole area of Lower Manhattan has been very much affected by it.
How many
police and fire are involved? Like how many all NYPD off-duty officers as they come in? Or like
All NYPD and FDNY officers are on duty now. And we're going to need all of them, and again, thanks to the governor and the way in which the state reacted, we will have 1,600 National Guard to relieve them over a period of time, so we can get some relief for them.
If anybody's looking for someone that may have been in the World Trade Center or in and around that area, what should they do? How can they get information?
We're going to give you numbers so that we can try to help coordinate that. Individual businesses have already done that, but we will as soon as we can find some time from the relief efforts, give you a number in which people can call, and then we can direct them to the right place.
The National Guard looting or anything like that? Any lawlessness?
There have been no reports of lawlessness.
The governor of New York State, Governor George Pataki, the mayor, Mayor Giuliani, between him, the police commissioner just over on the right side of the picture there, the fire commissioner, the police commissioner more than anybody else being almost a restraining influence there, trying to say both to the governor and to the mayor, be careful what you say here. We don't have information on this, that, and the other thing. And on this question of casualties, it is the mayor who is attested to what everybody's got going, rushing around in their minds at the moment. More casualties, more than anyone can bear, but not willing to make perfect sense, not willing at this point to put a number on the people who they believe have been killed and or injured. The mayor did say that in one of the parks in the lower part of Manhattan, 1,500 people were regarded as walking wounded. They were aware of 600 people in local hospitals, and New York City has 170 hospitals, and as the mayor said, every one of them is available under these circumstances. And there are 150 critical conditions which were taken out, which were medevaced out or taken out under other circumstances, some of them going across the river to New Jersey. And in one case, according to the Canadian television network, saying had been airlifted as far away as Canada in order to get special medical care. Canada has several very strong centers in burn treatment, so it may be one of the reasons that patients have gone up that far. The mayor returning again to this thing which has clearly moved him, I think, more than anything else today, getting down there and seeing the two trade towers before they collapsed on themselves, and seeing the fires burning up high, and he said it every time, and seeing the people jumping from the top of the trade towers, driven to their deaths by the encroaching fire in the rooms in which they no longer felt they were particularly safe. And Governor Pataki, I think the first person today to say in the clearest language has got to be a retaliation. Lots of people said, if you find out who has done this, you've got to be held accountable. Mayor being reluctant to say whether or not the country was in a state of war, which is a technical thing, I think, for him in many ways. But that's pretty much, I think, the summary of the highlights of their news conference, in which there seems to be a real coordination between the local and the state and the federal. And we have here with us a man who should know whether or not it's working, Jerry Hauer, who's the former head of New York City Mayor's Office of Emergency Management. And the last time I saw you was in that place on the west side of Manhattan, which you had designed for just an event, or maybe an event not just like this.
Yeah, this certainly is an incredible event, Peter. I don't think in our wildest imagination you could think about a day where simultaneous attacks, we all think about it, we plan for it, but to have something like this occur is certainly, I view it as an attack on our nation.
But was it? I understand your emotional state. I'd like
Sure.
Everybody's the same. I think we're all the same.
Sure.
Did you never consider that this was a possibility?
Well, we consider, and as we plan for New York City, we plan for massive events. In point of fact, one of the things that we did when I was still heading up OEM was we put in place memorandums of understanding with New Jersey, with Connecticut, Nassau, Suffolk County, to ensure that there was enough medical care available, that we had ambulances, police, firefighters, because we had to plan for horrific types of events. And as I told you when you were down, we planned for various types of incidents, chemical and biological types of attacks, for explosive types of attacks. This is clearly just a devastating type of an incident here in the city.
The Office of Emergency Management that bunker, it's a pretty elegant bunker, and nor is it underground. It was second and third floors, right. I think. That's out of operation at the moment.
Yeah, my understanding
That's
is...
something you never planned for.
Yeah, well, in fact, we did. The alternate was to go to police headquarters or to another location in the event that the command center was inactivated for some reason or rendered useless.
Do you know what has happened to it today? Do you know precisely what's happened to it?
I talked to some folks down there, and my understanding is that a lot of the debris has fallen and has blocked the access to the building. I've heard some reports that they're concerned about the structural stability of the building, but I have not been able to confirm that. But as part of our plan, there were backups. You always have backups in your planning, and that's what the city is doing today.
Now, you've had to walk to get here today, and that's perfectly understandable. We're on the west side of Manhattan, and things are that difficult. But do you have a sense of how it's going? And we've heard the mayor's appraisal and accepted as an honest one. Do you have any sense of how the system's working, and do you have any sense of how many people are still trapped or dead?
Well, first of all, I think that things are working as they should. I think that, when you've got the best police and fire department anywhere in the world, they are doing everything to try and rescue people, to try and get near the building. But you've got to also realize the dynamics in a situation like this change a bit when you have a number of police and firefighters injured as well, and that's what we saw this morning. I was listening to the fire radio this morning when the building collapsed, and they were screaming for help because firefighters were trapped. So the emotion changes a bit, but these are extremely professional people. These are very heroic people. They will do everything they can to try and get in and rescue anybody that could potentially be alive in that building, recognizing that there is a potential for additional collapse.
What about the prospect, as the governor's announced, of the National Guard being called into New York for an act of terrorism? Is this anything you ever envisioned, and what will they do?
Well, in fact, that's the question, John, what they'll do. I would imagine that they will help support the police department, the fire department, provide logistical support, manpower, help with search and rescue. Whether or not they'll be used for law enforcement purposes, traffic control, things like that, I think I've not been privy to those discussions, so I don't know. But that's certainly possible.
Leading up to the millennium, you personally designed a series of exercises where a disaster would unfold and they would respond to it, a tabletop exercise, a field exercise, and then another disaster, and then another, to make it more and more difficult to stretch the resources to the limit. Was that worst case scenario design that you put together to see if the city could handle such a momentous disaster anything close to this, or have a component like this?
Yeah, as we were planning for the millennium, we were planning for millions of people in Times Square and for the potential of something happening there. And we had to look at where all those resources would come from.
So did you have, in your design, did you have a truck bomb go off and then something else happen?
We had a sequence of events, both explosions, chemicals, biological incidents, and we looked at various types of terrorist events. And, I think that what you're seeing here today is the result of having the New York City Fire Department, New York City Police Department well prepared. But again, I don't care where you are, anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world.
For this.
An incident like this is difficult and certainly stresses any system anywhere in the world. And then when you have a number of injuries to police and firefighters, it really does change the dynamics.
Did you ever imagine in your various scenarios that a building, not to mention two separate buildings, basically, in case of the trade towers, would collapse on one another?
We did plan for building collapse, for bombings, and that was part of our routine planning.
Is there some hint there of what the operation now faces in terms of what you went through?
Well, what happens from here on out is a very slow process because first of all, you've got to put the fire out, and my understanding is there's gas lines feeding the fire, and it is not out. So before you can really start doing a search and rescue in the middle of the building or even recovering those victims, you've got to get that fire out.
Yeah. The mayor did just say a moment ago the gas has been turned off in city buildings. That would seem to be to have alleviated one very pressing problem for much of the morning.
Yes, but we still see that it's burning. We see that it continues to burn, and You can do some search and rescue around the periphery of what's burning, but to actually get into the area that's burning, this is going to be a long-term process.
John?
Now, you mentioned something about continuity of government contingency plans. What are we seeing in New York and in Washington where the officials are not, where we're accustomed to seeing them, not in the White House, not operating out of City Hall? Have they gone to ground?
You have to in a situation like this, when you view that the country has been attacked. You have to have alternative sites for the mayor, for the governor to operate from, to continue government.
On the assumption that their regular sites are potential targets?
Oh, sure. You have to do that. And I would imagine that's what's happening in Washington as well. There are very sophisticated continuity of government plans in Washington. They have evacuated most of the government office buildings. And I would imagine things are locked down pretty tight, and key officials have been moved to key locations, to secure locations to ensure that there is a continuity of government.
Jerry Howard, thank you for the moment. Don't go away if you feel inclined to stay and help. We're very grateful.
Yeah.
The man who set up these headquarters office down on the west side, which are now usable in terms of the Mayor's Office of Emergency Management. And management is the big issue. But as you listen to you two guys talk there for a second, you realize how this ripples out. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, has just now ordered, actually a short while ago, just ordered all civilian flights to cease over London. And so the impact of this one event, not only across the United States, but now being felt overseas, is constantly alive. And there are a couple of new pieces of information, too, about the flights in question that we have been so focused on today. In the case of American Flight 11, this was the one that first crashed into the trade towers this morning at 8:48, just a little before 9 o'clock this morning. ABC's Lisa Stark, who covers aviation for us, now says that a flight attendant called from the plane to say that 2 flight attendants had been stabbed, and people on board the aircraft had broken into the flight deck, into where the captain and the co-pilot, and in the case of a 767, can't recall, they're not an engineer, but certainly broken into the cockpit, where the pilot and the co-pilot were located. 2 hostages, 2 flight attendants stabbed. And in the case of United Airlines Flight 737, which was the aircraft the United Airlines was crashed just near Pittsburgh, Lisa does confirm for us our reporting of a little while ago that a passenger did call from a cell phone on the phone to an emergency service, a 911 emergency service. They managed to do from the air to say that in fact they were in the process of being hijacked. And Ann Compton, one of our White House correspondents, calls just a short while ago to say that the president has landed again, this time at an Air Force base in Nebraska. And this suggests, that the Secret Service is still very much in charge of the president's movements at the moment, and that there is a very strong feeling in the highest reaches of government that the president should stay on the move. He's going to stay there, conceivably, for the next little while, because we've also been told by Ann that he's going to speak to the National Security Council this afternoon on a teleconference. The president to stay abroad. I suppose you can do that from Air Force One as well. I'm not altogether sure. I think you probably can. But the president is going to talk to the National Security Council from somewhere other than Washington, and he is now in Nebraska. As I think Terry Moran, our White House correspondent, and others mentioned very early on in the day, it's a very delicate line for the president to follow. Stay on the move, lest there be any security threat to the president, and this will be absolutely decided by the national leadership of the Secret Service in conjunction with the National Security Council, while the political operatives in the president's entourage very much want him, we're told by Claire Shipman and others, to get him back to Washington to be in control in the place which is familiar to most Americans. And Mrs. Bush is, of course, we've already said, is at an undisclosed location, and Vice President Cheney, who carries an enormous load in this particular administration, is currently working out of the White House. John McCarthy, who covers the Pentagon, national security, and a good deal of terrorism and international intelligence issues for us, is at the Pentagon. John, what have you got?
A whole plate full of things, Peter. First of all, we've been talking throughout the day about possible ship movements, American ship movements. It is true that 2 aircraft carriers, 5 other combatants, and a hospital ship are now all heading north along the Atlantic seaboard toward New York. No decision has yet been made about exactly what to do with those ships when they get there, but of course aircraft carriers have a very large hospital capability, so they could be used for that. I think it is a responsive measure. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, after the attack on the Pentagon, went immediately to the gash that you see behind me here when the very first destruction was detected and helped pull some people out of the rubble. He is now in what is called the National Military Command Center in the Pentagon, and he intends to stay there indefinitely until all forces around the world have been secured. All forces around the globe at this point are at ThreatCon Delta, which is the highest level of threat condition that American troops can be in. One of the difficulties with the fire and the rescue effort here in the Pentagon, Peter, is we have seen continuous outbreaks of fires within the different levels of the Pentagon, and it has been extremely difficult for search and rescue people to get inside the Pentagon. It was 5 hours before the first people were able to get into some of the rubble to try to begin to pull out people who may have been trapped. The fire in the Pentagon was described as an inferno by those people who were in some of the worst areas. The evacuation in parts of the Pentagon was very orderly. Some of it was complete chaos, as you might expect.
Okay, John, thanks very much. John McCarthy at the Pentagon. We just take a quick look at John there. Jackie, there for a second? I want to put John on camera for a second because earlier today you described, you just turn around and take a look at that gash in the Pentagon there and describe again for us. You think it's what, 200 feet wide, 200 to 300 feet wide?
It is at least 200 or 300 feet wide, Peter. Just imagine a very large commercial aircraft ramming into this space. The Pentagon is built like a blockhouse, as you know, during World War II. It is a very substantial building, and this aircraft, traveling at between 150 and 200 miles an hour, penetrated deeply into the rings of the Pentagon, almost to the center. The destruction on the 5 floors that are above ground is considerable. One of the admirals was briefing us earlier that he felt that the section that was hit was one of the areas that was being repaired. We now believe that is not true. It is an area that was very fully staffed, primarily with Navy and Marine Corps personnel, but also the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Okay, thanks very much, John McCarthy at the Pentagon. We'll come back to you. On the phone with us at the moment is the former CIA Director, James Woolsey. Mr. Woolsey, there's so much to ask you about at a moment like this in terms of your experience, but as our political director, or actually that's not true, as a former senior White House official said a short while ago to one of us, there's going to be a hellacious amount of finger pointing at the moment. What's gone wrong here?
Well, one thing that's gone wrong, Peter, I think, is that for some years now, we have adopted a theory that terrorism first was likely just to be sort of a pickup team, these loose associations of terrorists inspired, say, by the Blind Sheikh in New York. This was the thought in the 2 bombings, one attempted, one real in New York back in the early 90s. And then the Clinton administration veered off into saying everything looked like it might be Osama bin Laden. It's important that we realize there is a real possibility when you have something this devastating and well coordinated that there could be state action of some sort behind it. Now, I don't know that that's the case, and I won't say that it's the case, but there is at least a plausible case that there was Iraqi government involvement in the World Trade Center bombing back in 1993. This all has to do with the identity, the true identity of Ramzi Youssef, who was the mastermind who's in prison out in Colorado now. At his sentencing, the judge said, "We still don't really know who you are." And if there was a chance that there was Iraqi government involvement in that, since Youssef was the mastermind of the World Trade Center and of a bombing plot in the Pacific, which he was working on when he was caught, to have a lot of American airlines in the Pacific blown up. What happened today is a sort of amalgam of the earlier 2 Ramzi Youssef plots. It's at least, I think, interesting that that's the case. And if some of the observers, Laurie Milroy and others, are correct, that there's a reasonable chance that he was, in fact, involved with the Iraqi government, there could also be a chance that the Iraqi government is involved here, even if bin Laden or other terrorist groups are as well.
Can I just ask you just a couple of really elementary questions about intelligence? You've just done something on the air which strikes me as what intelligence officers do when they sit down to try to figure out what the heck is going on. Is that in fact what you're trying to do at the moment? You called it an amalgam of two plots. Is that how it works at the moment?
Well, this is nothing but circumstantial evidence that I've been talking about, but it's interesting circumstantial information anyway. And yes, that's the sort of thing that I think intelligence officers need to do. Part of the problem with the World Trade Center bombing back in '93 is that most of the information about it was under grand jury secrecy until the trial, and after that, not many people paid attention to it. So even most of the federal government had no access to it except outside the FBI and parts of justice.
Now, you mentioned governments and individual organizations or operations. Don't governments traditionally leak information more than independent or semi-independent terrorist cells? If there were a government involved, is it not inconceivable that the United States didn't pick up something?
I think it's possible that a government could be involved and not be picked up, especially if it was operating very carefully, as the Iraqis or conceivably the Iranians might under these circumstances. It is normally somewhat easier to learn what's going on inside a government than a terrorist group, particularly one that doesn't use many communications and the like, and does everything within just a very small number of people. But it's not impossible that terrorist groups could work together with a government. The Iraqi government has been quite closely involved with a number of the Sunni terrorist groups, and on some matters has had contact with bin Laden. So,
I'm sorry, Mr. Woolsey, I think I just lost you.
I said on some matters.
Lost at the moment, and I hope we'll get him back on the telephone. The former director of the CIA, James Woolsey, on the phone, agreeing that there's going to be a heck of a lot of finger pointing at the FBI, at the Department of Defense, and at the CIA. No, I have my FP, thank you very much. I just lost the director of the CIA. Okay, thank you very much. Because, as this former official in the White House points out, people are going to demand massive retaliation. Mr. Woolsey raises two quite fascinating possibilities. One, that there is a terrorist organization or group involved with a government, that there is, as there has been believed in the past, a terrorist operation within the Iranian political establishment, which perhaps even other parts of the Iranian political establishment didn't know about. And similarly true, though much likely, for them to be operating in ignorance of Saddam Hussein inside Iraq as well. But the reason that, and I bring John Miller back briefly in on this again, the reason he suggests an amalgam, Mr. Woolsey does, of two footprints is because of the potential, never perfectly proved, that Ramzi Youssef, who has been on trial and convicted of the first trade tower attack, did seem to have some tenuous connection with Iraq.
And that this is a mixture of the two plots that were his two big capers. One, the plot to blow up numerous airlines on the Pacific route targeting American tourists. The other to blow up the World Trade Center. Here, planes, American carriers have been used to attack the World Trade Center.
Okay, I apologize.
No, as Mr. Woolsey pointed out, the difficulty with Ramzi Youssef and really getting to the bottom of the World Trade Center was, while he escaped as the mastermind and while he was captured in a guest house funded by bin Laden, nobody ever knew who sent him in the first place, or what his real nationality was, or even what his real name was, which set him apart from all the other people connected with those cases. Truly a mystery man, still in prison here in America.
As somebody said a little while ago, too, in terms of everything we're looking at now, suspects, there's no good options on the table in this regard whatsoever. Let's try to keep up with the running developments of the day. Lisa Stark is with us from Seattle. She covers aviation for us. And Lisa, when we last commented on the status of this plane, we have at least at least two of them in the process of being hijacked.
Right. Peter, here's what we...
This is a breaking news update from Oklahoma's News Channel 8.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Ely to update you on local developments in America under siege. At this point, it's clear there is no danger to anyone in eastern Oklahoma. However, there is some confusion over gas prices that is causing concern for some people. Now, we're told that our crews are seeing long gas lines at a number of stations in our viewing area. At this point, there is no indication of any major price increases. In fact, Citgo and Sinclair both tell us there is no indication of any big price change in the gasoline supply system. While it's not unusual in a crisis situation to have prices move a small amount on emotion, the experts tell us there are no reasons for panic buying. We had reports of stations charging more than $2 a gallon. Only one has been confirmed. Apparently, some prices being raised by individual station owners not supported by the market. Let's join Oklahoma's News Channel 8 Jerry Giordano at a busy station in Glenpool. And Jerry, any price changes there at this point?
Actually, Chuck, no, there's not. We're here at 141st and Highway 75, where the price is $1.55 a gallon. I talked to a friend a short time ago who got gas in downtown Tulsa, paid the same thing. So no indication of any price changes here at the major chains. But what is different is folks are basically lining up for several blocks, and there's a police presence here because it's pretty much organized chaos here. Lots of people panicking, for lack of a better word, and we're told by city officials and by area police that there is no need to panic. There is plenty of gas for everyone. There is no indication of any major price changes in the area. So if you're worried it's going to go up to $4.99 tomorrow, we're told that is likely not going to happen. But folks still lining up nonetheless, people waiting as long as 15 to 20 minutes just to fill up their tanks. Again, if you don't need the gas, don't go out and get it, because basically we're told by officials that you're simply wasting your time waiting in line. And of course, we'll keep you up to date with developments. I'm Jerry Giordano reporting live in Glenpool. Chuck, back to you.
We thank you very much, Jerry. Once again, no reason to panic. The market simply doesn't support it. In other developments, Tulsa International Airport is closed to air traffic. All domestic airline flights have landed. 13 aircraft were diverted here to Tulsa and remain on the ground. Locally, Tulsa Community College and ORU have closed as a precaution, along with state and federal offices and the Promenade Mall and several chain stores around town. Now, if you'd like to help, as Tulsans always do, you can contact the Red Cross to donate blood. That number, 831-1151, 831-1151. That's for blood donations. The Red Cross also has a number for those trying to reach relatives in New York and Washington you've had trouble getting through. That number, 831-1149, 831-1149. Once again, we have crews out working all the local angles on this story, but there is no indication of any danger to anyone in eastern Oklahoma, just the problem of possible panic with folks not being informed about the gas prices. Be sure to stay with Oklahoma's News Channel and ABC for all the latest on this breaking story.
Intelligence to penetrate some of these groups before acts like this can be carried out. We may need to do even more to beef up. Obviously, I suppose we need to do even more to beef up our airport security. There's a lot along those lines, I think, that needs to be done, and mostly, I think, strengthen our intelligence capabilities.
You are the second person, second senior former government official to say to us today, to imply very clearly that human intelligence in those areas of the world which are to some extent breeding grounds of terrorism are plainly weak.
Well, they are weak, Peter. We went on a real witch hunt with our CIA back in the early mid-'70s. We had hearings. I won't mention the name of the legislator who conducted those hearings, but they, in effect, resulted in our eliminating a lot of our human intelligence capabilities. It's a dirty business. When you have human intelligence, you're doing business with the kinds of people that will commit these acts. Sometimes the first test of a human intelligence agent, the first test they send them out on is to go out and kill somebody. So it's pretty tough for America to get into that, and we got out of it. But it may be that we have to get into that kind of business.
Mr. Secretary, why don't you just name the legislator, because you're just going to cause more trouble for me to go to the file and look it up. Who held these hearings, and what's the point you're trying to make?
Well, they were the church committee hearings, and what I think we did as a consequence of those hearings was to, in effect, unilaterally disarm in terms of our intelligence capabilities. Now, we have the best, technological intelligence gathering operations and capabilities in the world, but we need this human intelligence to penetrate groups like the group that must have carried out these operations.
I have only a vague recollection of this, but I think the point you're making is that there are some forces, political and otherwise, in the United States who believe that getting down and dirty with potential terrorists around the world is not something we should be doing, that we should do it all technically, therefore not put people at risk?
That's correct. That was the thinking, and that's pretty much the policy we followed since then. And I think we need to get back into the down and dirty business so we can penetrate these groups and hopefully prevent these types of things from happening in the future.
Mr. Baker, I don't want to get ahead of things, and I'm sure you do not either. But if there is, and as somebody said earlier, there are no good options out there at the moment. But do you believe that the United States is, if it finds out that a state is involved, going to have to go to war in an active way against that state?
Well, first of all, I don't believe we're going to find out that a state is involved. I cannot really, frankly, conceive of a state doing this. There could be, I suppose, some indirect assistance from a state or groups within a state, and I don't think that's going to be the case. But if it were the case, I think we need to do whatever we reasonably and responsibly can to protect the American people, whatever that involves.
Now, this is always the toughest question for somebody who has been in office but is not currently. How much easier is it to say what you do now that you're not in government? In other words, were you the Secretary of State in the Bush administration at the moment? Now, would you not feel rather constrained by modern circumstances as to what you could do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, frankly, Peter, we have some laws on our books that we ought to take a look at. One of them is simply a presidential executive order that says the United States doesn't go out and assassinate people. I think there was a very good reason behind that, but I dare say that you would have about 99%, if not 100% public support across the United States today if we found out that one terrorist group was responsible for these incidents. You would have 100% support almost for taking care of the person who leads that group.
One of the difficulties, of course, Mr. Baker, is that in a situation like this, we end up fighting like the terrorists to some extent, right?
Well, that is unfortunately the case. That's true, but it may be that that's the only way we can really take care of the problem. You know, the president said today, he made a statement I think was absolutely the right statement. He said America is under attack, under terrorist attack, and he said we are going to hunt down and punish those we find responsible for this. And that, to my way of thinking, means doing whatever is required.
Mr. Baker, thanks very much for the time.
Thank you.
James Baker, the former Secretary of State, also widely known in the country as the man who did as much as he did to win Florida for George Bush at the last presidential election, but a longtime member of the American political and foreign policy establishment, and who knows how complicated this is, and who makes a very open, you'll hear this a lot in the next few days, not enough human intelligence, and we'll review who that legislator was. Tony Cordesman, our military analyst. Are you listening to Mr. Baker? Is he making sense?
He is, Peter, but I think we need to have an important caution here. Human intelligence isn't as simple as it sounds. The actual agents can take years to develop. Historically, they've often been unreliable, and the more hostile the ideology is, the more uncertain the collection. Human intelligence is also analysis. Our analytic side is weak. The CIA has had hiring freezes. There is so little money for CIA and for DIA that most of the country analysts have never been to the countries they're actually analyzing, much less talked to many of the elements within them. And as Secretary Baker pointed out, if you're going to go into operations, that's different from human intelligence, and our operations capability has been allowed to decline for nearly a decade.
Thank you, Tony. The game has changed a good deal today, so let us get back. Yes, John.
Before Jerry Howard leaves us, and he's promised to come back, all of the discussions we've had raised the question to me, and I know Jerry's been more fully briefed on these national security agencies matters than any of us have. How many of these attacks have we known about and been able to prevent? How many that we've heard about? How many that we haven't heard about? And have any of them been on this scale?
That's difficult to answer, John, because a lot of that material is classified. A lot of that is kept classified, but there clearly are a number of threats that occur in this country almost on a daily basis. Some of them are hoaxes. Some of them are credible. Some of them are quite credible. And the spectrum varies. And They've had, and some we've been very fortunate with, as we were right before the millennium with the
intrusion from Canada.
Yeah,
but that was one that was the work of an alert agent. How many have we actually prevented through intelligence, which is kind of what Mr. Woolsey and Mr. Baker have been talking about?
I'm not sure anybody has a good number on that. That's something that I think that would be difficult to put your finger on at this point. And I'd be interesting to get that from the FBI. I'm not sure that I've ever heard a number on how many we've actually thwarted.
Have you ever picked up the phone in your emergency management center and had someone on the other end who said we're going to blow up something?
We actually did receive a number of threats.
What was it like?
We had some letters come in, and we turned them over to the FBI. By and large, we felt that the majority of them were hoaxes, but we relied on the FBI for their intelligence, for their analysis of threats. We relied on the police department intelligence division. And by and large, with the exception of one or two that were a little more credible than others, most of them were pretty lame hoaxes.
I remember two of those that were quite serious. In 94 and 95, when I was with the police department, we received information from the FBI that there was going to be a truck bomb attack within 48 hours on the New York Stock Exchange. We responded by surrounding it literally with sanitation sand trucks and blocking the street, and eventually set up a cordon which has still not come down. The other was a planned attack on the Israeli mission to the United Nations, which has been surrounded by cement blocks, first the sand trucks, and ever since again.
Our thanks to Jerry Hauer, the former head of the New York Mayor's Office of Emergency Management and Operations, and as we said at the beginning, it's an office which is not operating in the place that Jerry Hauer set it up, which was right adjacent to the World Trade Center, and it has been blocked off, put out of commission in one way or another by the horrendous devastation which has occurred in that part of town today. And we don't want to lose sight of it for a second in all this discussion about intelligence and terrorism. So I want to go back to George Stephanopoulos who's closer to the building than anybody else, and then Bill Blakemore. They are both watching the search and rescue operations, and both report now. George?
Well, Peter, we still don't know that it is a search and rescue operation yet. Just a little while ago, one of the volunteers who tried to go down there and help reported back and said when you actually got to the scene, and you see it behind me, that cloud of black smoke, when you actually got to the scene at the World Trade Center, what was most remarkable, what was most amazing, what was most horrifying is that basically nothing was happening. They couldn't go into the building and actually perform any real rescue operations. And he also described the scene very close to the World Trade Center, soot and silt up to his waist. He said it was hell. We have also talked to some firefighters who've gotten fairly close to the scene. They've now set up a special command center over here at Manhattan Borough Community College here on the west side where they're relieving each other. One fireman said that he was buried underneath all the dirt and debris, had to dig himself out, but still didn't know what had happened to his 6 partners who had gone into the building and near the building.
George, can I just interrupt you for a sec? I'll come right back to you. But Ann Compton, who's been with the president all day, is on the phone from Nebraska, and we don't want to lose her if we can have her. Annie, can you hear me?
Yes, Peter, I can.
What are you doing in Nebraska?
Well, we didn't know where we were till we landed. President Bush is here at the home of the Strategic Command. This is the area, this is the base where those big doomsday aircraft are kept. And he has disappeared down the rabbit hole, Peter, down through a red brick small building. He and what skeleton staff are with him down into an underground bunker where Ari Fleischer tells me the president is going to chair a National Security Council meeting by teleconference. We're also told that the president has been on the phone several times with the vice president, who is able to work out of a command center at the White House itself in one of the secure areas down below in the White House.
Annie, your description of the president going down the rabbit hole, going into a very secure compound bunker in Nebraska at Offutt Air Force Base suggests that people in his entourage believe there has been a threat today, or a potential threat to the highest political leadership in the country. Is that correct?
Well, and I asked exactly that question. They say there was no hint of any warning of the attacks that came on the East Coast today. But as you know, they always take the precaution, especially once the Pentagon was hit, that the president might be a target as well. And that is why he has come to as secure a place as he could, where he is trying to marshal the forces. He's also talking to some of the civilian leaders on the ground, including Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki. But we were told there was no direct threat to him and no advance warning, and that in itself, Peter, is distressing to the very small number of staff of the president here at Offutt.
So the procedures are in place, and they do what they do, right?
Well, you know, in 27 years of covering presidents and crises, we have never played the kind of hunted game that was played today, where we would take off in the plane and not know where we were going to land, and then once we landed in Louisiana, where we were literally told not to use cell phones so our location couldn't be pinpointed, to take off again and head to the center. It does feel like a cat and mouse game. Ari Fleischer, when I asked him if the president feels in jeopardy or hunted, he said the president understands that this is kind of the precaution that is necessary at a time like this, and that he's anxious to get back to Washington.
And for example, when you phoned us just a moment ago, thank goodness you did you have to ask permission to do it?
No, because it is hard to hide a great big airplane like Air Force One. And when we were coming in, I could tell we were over a flat area, a fairly urban area. And I guessed it was Nebraska, knowing that we hadn't been that far out of Louisiana. And indeed, as we came down over the field, I saw a TV satellite truck out on the highway. And sure enough, on our screens inside the plane, we watched ourselves land. The local media was already here, figuring this is where the President of the United States and the Commander-in-Chief would land.
Because it's part of the old Strategic Air Defense Command.
Exactly right. It has the facilities, the secure facilities here, where the president can still be, as what Ari tells me, is seamlessly in touch with the command structure in Washington.
And which we remind ourselves, and I'm going to involve George Stephanopoulos in this conversation, but just think about how the world has changed, and yet in some respects hasn't. The president's gone to Nebraska to a facility which was designed during the Cold War, where the president might retreat or go in the case of a thermonuclear exchange or an atomic thermonuclear exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's really something to think about.
It's an amazing comment on where we are in the 21st century. You know, we have been checked our bags over and over again today. We take that kind of security routinely on Air Force One, but it's been double that today. And just the thought of Americans who are stranded in airports all across the country trying to get home today or tomorrow, the kind of security they will then face. Certainly the White House sees the ramifications and the impact of this extending through American life as far as you can see.
Annie, thank you very much. I hope you'll stay in fact, I know you'll stay in touch.
There are 5 of us who have been allowed to stay with the president, but we are not allowed in the underground bunker with him.
Say that again?
There are only 5 of us reporters who have been allowed to stay with him. Everyone else was left in Louisiana. There are 4 staff members, five of us from the press, and a very small Secret Service contingent. It was almost an empty Air Force One that brought us here. We don't know how we'll be here or when the president will find it safe.
This is a break.
But you're not in the
from Oklahoma's News Channel 8.
Good afternoon. I'm Charles Eady with the latest on the local level in America under attack. While security measures are in effect at Tulsa International, a number of institutions and businesses, we have no indications of any problems in our viewing area. Everyone here can certainly rest at ease. Joining us now live from Washington is Senator Jim Inhofe. Senator, are you there?
I am, Charles.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for joining us. Any feel at this point what our American government's response may be to this terrible situation?
No, there really isn't. There's some things that we can do short term and long term. My response to this was, maybe this is the wake-up call that finally will get some sense into mostly the Senate Armed Services Committee. Only last Friday we finished our markup of the authorization bill for this coming fiscal year. None of the stuff that we got in there, that we had in there to try to make America strong again, try to build a national missile defense system, try to modernize our forces, they're all just killed in committee right down party lines. And it's unfortunately they would, this euphoric attitude that the Cold War is over, there's no longer a threat out there, this should be gone by now. So maybe this will have the effect of starting a rebuilding policy here in Washington. Let's look at it this way, Charles. You know, as devastating as this was, if this had come in as a, on a missile, and of course they have the capability of doing that, any mentality that would run an airplane into the tower would also deploy a missile to come to New York City. Then you wouldn't be talking about, thousands of lives. You'd be talking about hundreds of thousands of lives. So it's just, I'm hoping there'll be a lesson learned from this. Now, as far as what we're doing immediately, we've been trying to get new technologies in terms of detecting instead of relying on old, antiquated X-ray technology, and I think that's going to be looked at. But the brilliant minds that are behind these perverted acts of terrorism, they think of new things. And so we've just got to defend ourselves as well as possible and hope that the ultimate weapon doesn't come over, and that's a nuclear warhead.
Well, Senator, I know you've been involved with intelligence issues there on the Hill. Do you have any faith that we're going to find who's responsible and be able to get some culpability in this?
Oh, no, I think we will. And I think, we talk about bin Laden, we talk about the Omar and all the possibilities out there, or it could be a state-sponsored terrorist act. And I think we'll find out. This is too big not for us to find out. But we're going to have to do something. One of the things most people don't realize, Charles, is that our defense budget is tied to our intelligence budget, or vice versa, I should say. So we have had a very inferior intelligence system, and not just the FBI and the CIA, but our entire intelligence community has been really deprived over the last 10 years. So we need to get that beefed up, and we need to do a better job so that we'd be able to determine if some of these things are going to happen and take whatever steps are necessary.
Well, Senator, what about governments like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria that sort of absorb a cloak of neutrality but yet aid terrorists like the Libyans have done for so many years? When something like this happens, essentially an act of war, should they lose that phony cloak of neutrality?
Well, I certainly think so. I mean, let's keep in mind also that anything that the technology that China now has, which is certainly the missile technology to reach the United States, as we all well know that, and North Korea has it too. They're sharing the technology and systems with countries like the ones you just mentioned, like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Pakistan, and so we should not be able to sit here and somehow euphorically say that there's no problem out there, that these people are going to be neutral, they're not going to do it. I believe that we need to be, at this point, suspicious of anyone until we can then start narrowing it down. We will find out. I'm convinced that we will find out.
What about commercial aviation? I know you've been involved in the aviation committees. Can we do more in terms of protecting commercial aviation? You mentioned X-rays. What about sky marshals, all those kinds of things, narrower flight lanes? Are there a lot of steps that can be taken to make that more secure, make hijackings of this kind less likely?
We've got to do that. Now, you mentioned skyjackers, and yet we have had a pretty good program. I'm not sure just how far-reaching it is. For a while, we had them everywhere the last time we had a scare. Now it's not quite that way, and so I think that PFNA, for example, is a new technology on determining what goes into aircraft. It's a detection method that is so much better than the old archaic systems we've been using. And there have been some political reasons why we haven't been able to get into these innovative new ideas. I think we'll be able to do that now. But yeah, let's keep in mind this happened in a way that nobody ever predicted, with a skyjacking 4 airplanes simultaneously and then doing their destruction. But they'll think of something else, and so we've just got to do a better job of defending America. I've always said that the number one, and a lot of members up here in Washington don't agree with this, that the primary function of government is to defend our citizens, and we have not been doing a good job of it for the last few years.
Well, Senator, we thank you very much for your time. That's Senator Jim Inhofe live from Washington, D.C. We should note the only known problem at this time in this area is confusion over gasoline prices. We've had a number of reports of stations charging $2, $2.50, $2.70. If you're paying that kind of money for gasoline, it is not the thing to do at this point. The experts tell us there is no reason for price increases or reason for panic buying. The markets do not support it. There is no evidence of higher prices in the gasoline supply chain at this time. Now, individual price increases may be the result of individual owners raising their prices in a panic situation, but it is purely, we're told, a matter of emotion. Citgo and Sinclair are both telling us today there is no reason for price increases. If someone wants you to pay that today, you'd probably better save your money and stay home. Stay with Oklahoma's News Channel 8 and ABC for the very latest on this developing story throughout the day and the night.
Sure, they'll do that. They won't want him to go before the country again until he has more to say, and probably until he can say what actions he's going to take in response to this.
Okay, thanks, George Stephanopoulos, who, as he pointed out, was somewhat isolated from the violence there, because as close as they'll let you broadcast at this point, but you can still see the smoke coming up. It's felt all over the country. A number of newspapers around the country are now putting out special editions of the day. I remember when the Challenger exploded, we were on television for many, many, many hours, and which does, to some extent, isolate you from what is happening. You become a conveyor belt for information. Going back to the hotel and realizing that the New York Times and the Washington Post had then put out 30-some-odd page editions in terms of the Challenger disaster, John, and it just reminds you that you can be isolated from something that is so overwhelming. And George Stephanopoulos acknowledges he is not as close to the violence and tragedy. Like ABC's Bill Blakemore is somewhat closer. Bill, can you hear me? Bill Blakemore? Okay, we'll come back to Bill Blakemore. But Bill Blakemore has, we want to be as close as we can and not get in anybody's way. And I was pointing out that newspapers across the country publishing these special editions. There's not been a special edition of this magnitude probably since the Challenger disaster. Before that, Neil Armstrong walking on the moon, or in some cases, newspapers are putting out the first major special edition they've done since John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Many of the papers will clearly use terror in their banner headlines. Certainly the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel was one that did that with a subheading saying, "Attacks Rip Trade Center, Pentagon, America's soul." And I think a great many people in the country feel that is precisely what has happened today, that the trade towers, as we've said many times, these absolute symbols of the United States in so many ways, right there on the edge of Manhattan, first city in the New World, the great advertisement to the rest of the world of commerce and success and upward mobility and all that stuff, and those two trade towers are simply no longer there. And then the attack on the Pentagon, at the very heart of the establishment, the military government establishment today, and the deep psychological damage or wound, if not long-term damage, this is going to do to the country. And then we learned just a short while ago that United Airlines jet that was carrying 45 people, which crashed near Johnstown in Pennsylvania today, was, at least according to one congressman, James Moran, Democrat from Virginia, who had a Marine Corps briefing in Washington. He believes that aircraft was originally intending by its hijackers to go to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the mountains of Maryland, and the crash site actually turns out to be about 85 miles northwest of Camp David. So no one should be surprised, perhaps no one is, at the ripple effect at every level of government, not to mention in everybody's soul today, from this initial attack on the trade towers. One of our reporters, Ellen Davis, reports, by the way, from the American Red Cross in New York City. They've actually had so many volunteers for blood that about 1,200 people showed up at the blood donation center in New York City, and they actually have enough blood for now, except for people with type O and Rh negative blood, because they have a shortage of those. But in terms of all other types of blood, they seem to be in pretty good shape. John Miller, what are you finding on the telephone?
Basically, still that they are just beginning to try and mount a rescue operation in the Trade Center, that they are still trying to assess how many people are trapped inside, that they're still trying to collate the number of people that they removed to so many different hospitals in 2 states. And now, because our burn centers here in New York, of which there are only 3, have been overwhelmed even in Canada. So they're really just beginning what's going to be an operation that's going to take not days, but weeks, more likely months.
Let's go. Thank you, John. Let's go to ABC's Bill Blakemore, who I said is in lower Manhattan and closer even than George Stephanopoulos was able to get. Bill, do you hear me?
I do, Peter.
Go ahead.
There's an enormous search and rescue operation being mounted here for what's clearly going to be many days of grim work. We're just north of the wreckage and the smoke still coming out on the West Side Highway, right next to the Hudson River. Hundreds of firemen are reassembling and restaging here after their first partial defeat this morning, and they know that many of their colleagues are missing with the civilians in the wreckage. I've talked to several of them who were in one of the towers when the other one was collapsing, who barely got out. They're not quite sure how and can't even begin to talk about it. Tables have been set up in the street here by some of the officers who are helping them figure out who's going to go in when they can. There's a triage center that's been set up in the Manhattan Community College where bodies and people and survivors are going to be brought as they begin to figure out how badly they're injured. And we can tell, because they still can't go in, they're still milling around in the hot sun here, that it's going to take a long time before they can even begin to assess how many people there are who need their help in search and rescue, which is going to go on for some time. The streets just behind us are quite different. There's almost an eerie war scene type of feeling because much of this part of the West Village has emptied out. On this very clear, hot day, there are occasionally jet fighters circling overhead, so there's even just a touch of the feeling of covering a war. But for the most part, everybody is still looking at this enormous wreckage and just beginning to absorb what it is, and these firemen are eager and ready to get in there as they begin to gather themselves and dust themselves off from their first foray in this morning.
Bill, this is an excellent report. I just have this one question, and it may just simply be my own inability to grasp it visually. Are they actually getting into either of the former towers of the Trade Center, or are they still working on the outside perimeter?
I cannot tell you the exact answer to that. Many of them are still waiting on the outside of the perimeter to figure out how to get into the general area. When the North Tower collapsed, parts of the top of it fell over all the way over here to the river. And so they're still trying to sort out through the smoke just exactly where they can get into. They are not letting the media get anywhere near the actual base of the two towers themselves. But there's just a general sense of these accumulating hundreds of firemen, that they're ready to go in. They're waiting to find where an opening will be.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill Blakemore. ABC's Don Daler did manage to get, I think, pretty close to the building at one point earlier today. Don, are you there?
Yes, Peter, I'm here. I'm just back to about 4 blocks away, but I escorted a federal agent through the up to the side of the World Trade Center itself, and can tell you it is probably the most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life. There is total devastation, but beyond that, there's no non-gruesome way to describe this, but there are bodies and body parts on top of some buildings next to where the World Trade Center stood in the streets. There is still a number of fires going on in buildings surrounding it, including the Marriott building appears to be on fire. There's a building directly behind the federal office building. I can't identify which building it is, but it's a taller building. The police and the firemen are getting away from that area, but they're afraid that building will collapse as well. There have been a couple building collapses or portions of them collapsing from the flames. So there are some buildings that they are just letting burn to collapse because it's too dangerous for them to fight it right now.
Don, thanks very much, Don. And now here is we're going to go to a briefing now on behalf of the political wing of the president's. I'm sorry.
Just have a very brief statement, and I want Chief Jester to talk about the search and rescue efforts underway. No surprise, we have very, very few details. We'll tell you what we can at this stage, but we have very few details. This is a terrible day. It is a tragic day for America. Our thoughts and prayers are with the injured and their families and the casualties. We're taking every appropriate step and precaution to prevent further attacks. We're making every effort to take care of the injured still in the building, and we're taking every appropriate measure to determine who is responsible. The Secretary of Defense...
And at President Bush's direction, we are implementing it. We began to implement it immediately after the first attack in New York this morning. We contacted American forces and embassies throughout the world and placed them on high alert. The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe. They have also secured members of the National Security Team, the President's Cabinet, and senior staff. As you know, President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida when the first attack occurred this morning, Air Force One has now landed at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, and the President is in a secure location. He is in continuous communication with the Vice President and key members of his cabinet and national security team. Vice President Cheney and our National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, are in a secure facility at the White House. I have just come from there. The Secretary of Transportation and other members of our White House senior staff are gathered at a command center there, and we are coordinating with other branches of our federal government. The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington from his trip to South America. President Bush is conducting a meeting of the National Security Council as we speak. They are meeting President Bush from his location and other members from different locations in Washington and other locations. As many of you have been reporting, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport. International flights were diverted to alternate locations outside of the United States. Transportation Secretary Mineta has directed the Federal Aviation Administration to suspend operations until at least noon tomorrow. So no airline flights will operate until at least then and until the FAA announces that operations will be resumed. Secretary Mineta has also issued orders controlling the movement of all vessels in United States navigable waters. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has activated 8 urban search and rescue task forces in New York, and 4 of these highly trained teams are at work here in Washington at the Pentagon. Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks. The Department of Justice is setting up a hotline for families who fear that their relatives may have been victims of one of these attacks, and we will be announcing that telephone number shortly. Our fellow citizens and our freedom came under attack today, and no one should doubt America's resolve. President Bush and all our country's leaders thank the many Americans who are helping with rescue and relief efforts. We ask our fellow Americans for your prayers for the victims, for their families, for the rescue workers, and for our country. Thank you all very much, and we will continue to update you as information is available and confirmed.
Karen, how long will the president stay in Nebraska?
Return to the White House.
Will he go to back to Washington, Karen? Will he address the nation? If the vice president can stay in Washington, why can't the president do that?
Karen Hughes, the president. I must say, John Miller, that there's not an enormous amount of news in there if we've been following this event all day.
No, even the White House seems to be having difficulty gleaning the facts which officials in New York City just don't seem to know.
Yeah.
In terms of level of casualties, number of people killed.
And it's enormous. We're going to go to our White House correspondent, Claire Shipman, one of our White House correspondents, Claire Shipman, at the moment to see what's going on. But I'm very deeply sympathetic with the difficulty it is to get down to street level, either at the Pentagon or certainly in New York City, and understand the chaos and the tragedy that has appeared at ground level. Those of us sitting in newsrooms, bringing in, interpreting, analyzing information at a variety of levels are not doing a good enough job, because probably an impossible job to do, to try to have ourselves and you understand just what happened when that building fell in on each other. Listening to Bill Blakemore a short while ago and Don Daly, very helpful in terms of trying to understand it. But there is a delay in everything. There's a delay in government at the federal, state, and the national level. The airlines, of course, all across the country closed down. And it's true with news coverage as well, as best we can sense from here, that it's hard to get back from the immediate scene of this enough of a sort of texture to help us understand what enormous this is. Maybe you don't need it, maybe you already appreciate that, but that's our sense from here. But there's Karen Hughes making, the President has appeared, remember, twice. Claire Shipman ready? Claire?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
I can.
Much better you than me bring us up to date on what's happening in the presidential establishment, both there and elsewhere.
Well, let me tell you what we know so far. You obviously just heard a statement from Karen Hughes that seemed designed to try to express to the country that the government is still up and running. The political advisors, you've mentioned a couple of times, would very much like to see the president get back to Washington when it's safe so that he can address the country. But in the meantime, they certainly want to give the impression that everything is under control, that the vice president is at the White House, Condoleezza Rice is at the White House, the Federal Reserve is still operating, banks are open, HHS is mobilized, and I think that was the point she is trying to get across. We've been told that the president may be back as early as this evening. The AP was also reporting he's considering some sort of address to the nation this evening, but again, it may be that he will want to have something very specific to be able to tell the public before that happens. Colin Powell, we're told, is on his way back from Peru. It's not clear where he will head. At this moment, what has happened in terms of the Secret Service is that their plan has gone into effect for this sort of emergency. The first time, we're told, that a plan like this has been implemented in recent history, of course. But what it means is they have all of their protectees accounted for. They're satisfied with that now. Now we're told they're in level 2 where they're assessing the threat, and they will then decide things, for example, as to whether Colin Powell can go back and safely work at the State Department and whether the president can come back to Washington. In the meantime, as you probably know, there's been a state of emergency declared in the city of Washington and in the state of Virginia, allowing both of those places to be able to mobilize military and police forces as needed, Peter.
Thanks very much, Claire Shipman from Washington. It is very difficult to keep your hands on the political establishment today, in part because we rely on government so often in cases like this to tell us what is going on in their various departments, and it has been very difficult today to get, for example, the Federal Emergency Management Administration got involved in this today, but it's hard because of the communications problems all across the country to have a real appreciation of what they are participating. The most direct communication we've had has been with New York City on the ground, that is, other than in terms of the president's movements from Florida to Louisiana and now on to Nebraska, where he is going to stay for the indefinite future, though political staff keep saying he'd really like to come back to Washington.
There is something interesting in the laundry list of things that Karen Hughes, counselor to the president, said in the briefing we just looked at, which is one is that airspace will remain shut down under government control until noon tomorrow, and that the movements of ships around the coast will be regulated by the government. That suggests, I mean, we're talking about not a few hours, we're talking about halfway into the next day. That suggests that there's a real feeling in the intelligence community and in Washington that this may not be over, that they don't want to let go of the assets like air traffic, that they think could unleash even more attacks.
I wonder, John, if there is a real feeling in the intelligence community that may not be over, or, God, we didn't know any of this was going on. Maybe there's something else there that we don't have the vaguest idea about.
Precisely. I mean, it seems to be an abundance of caution and some degree of fear.
Okay. Now, we're joined by ABC's Betsy Stark, who covers business and economics for us. You add to this extraordinary notion of how much the national life has been interrupted today by an act of, or two acts of terrorism anyway. Start first with what businesses were in the World Trade Center. We've talked to people before about the number of people in the Trade Center.
Yeah.
And what else has happened?
Peter, it's astounding how much the Twin Towers are part of the life of the financial district. 10% of all the office space in Lower Manhattan is accounted for in those Twin Towers. 155 businesses, 50,000 workers, as you've said before, including some of the major financial firms. Morgan Stanley, the investment bank, has 50 floors in Tower 1. 50 floors, I believe is right. 12.5% of the space in that tower occupied by Morgan Stanley. Several, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which manage bridges and tunnels, the airports, the harbor, a major tenant, 9% of the space there. Several major insurance firms, Empire Blue Cross, Marsh and McLennan, and among the banks, Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, a couple of big trading firms, Credit Suisse, First Boston, and Oppenheimer Funds, which is a firm that manages several mutual funds. So lots of the big names on Wall Street were in those Twin Towers.
And in terms, the markets were closed today.
The markets were closed. Stock markets throughout the country. Trading was halted in some of the foreign markets. The foreign markets reacted very negatively, obviously, to this news, down sharply, and no decision has been made yet as to whether they will be trading on the New York Stock Exchange tomorrow. They need to make decisions in conjunction with federal, state, and local authorities about the safety of trading, about whether the people who work at those exchanges are going to be able to get to work. And I talked to people who were at the New York Stock Exchange this morning, and they felt the tremors there, and one described it as like an earthquake.
And would you say that in your communications with people in the financial community today, they're afraid of what might happen next?
This is obviously a great blow to confidence at a time when confidence is already very fragile. This was a direct attack on the symbols of the center of finance in New York City, showing just how vulnerable it is. So I think that there's concern about how the markets will react, whether anxiety will build, and there's a sense that we want to see a strong showing of U.S. leadership.